The sky was grey, the sea endless. A longship rose on a swell of dark water, its sail taut in the wind, its crew silent beneath layers of wool and salt. In this moment, somewhere in the vast mist-shrouded North Atlantic, a journey continued, one that had begun generations earlier in the rugged fjords of Norway. 1,000 years ago, Norse explorers sailed into the unknown, not in fleets of warships, but in open-decked longboats, crafted of pine and oak, soaked in seawater and driven by muscle, wind and will. They carried no maps, no compass, only the sun, the stars, and their memory. They weren't chasing empire, they were chasing possibility. From Norway to Shetland, from Orkney to the Faroes, from Iceland to Greenland, and finally to a land beyond all knowledge, a place they would call Vinland. They crossed entire oceans with nothing but wood beneath their feet and the horizon ahead. They braved volcanic plains, glacier-walled fjords, and dense forests that whispered of danger and promise. They built homes from sod and timber, hunted walrus on icy shores, and forged iron where no forge had ever burned before. But who were these Viking pioneers? What drove them to leave everything behind? Homeland, kin, certainty, for lands no one had ever seen. Were they simply Norsemen from Norway? Or something more? A fusion of peoples, cultures, and bloodlines carried by wind and wave. Why did some settlements thrive for centuries, while others vanished into snow and silence? This is not just a story of exploration. It is a story of resilience, of reinvention, of human greatness at the edge of the known world. And it's a story written not only in sagas, but in DNA, iron slag, and the soil beneath our feet. It is time to rediscover the forgotten voyage. In the high valleys of western Norway, where mountains rise like walls and farmland clings to narrow ledges, the people live close to the sea and even closer to hardship. Land was scarce, power was concentrated in the hands of ambitious chieftains. Young men, sons without inheritance and families with nothing to lose, looked outward. They looked west, and so began one of the boldest migrations in human history. By the late 700s, Norse longships were appearing along the coasts of England, Scotland, and Ireland. First came raids, swift, terrifying strikes, but that wasn't the whole story. Soon after came settlers. They didn't just burn, they built. By the mid-9th century, the Norse had established themselves in the Northern Isles. Shetland, Orkney, the Hebrides. These rocky stepping stones became the path to something greater. In AD 825, they reached the Faroe Islands, wind-battered, isolated, and yet promising. They endured. Then came Iceland, rising from the ocean like a black, volcanic beacon. Around AD 871, Norse settlers arrived and quickly multiplied. Within 2 decades, more than 24,000 people had crossed some of the world's most dangerous seas to forge a society on the edge of the Arctic. These were not just warriors. They were shipwrights, farmers, herders, ironworkers, and they came as families. They brought livestock, tools, beliefs, and above all, the knowledge of how to endure. But still they sailed farther. In 985, a man named Eric the Red, banished from Iceland for killing a neighbor in a feud, led a fleet west across an ocean even colder and more dangerous than the last. What he found was a land of high cliffs and narrow fjords, of green meadows hugged by glaciers. He named it Greenland. It was a promise as much as a name. There, Norse settlers built a fragile new world. They raised cattle. They carved stone churches. They married, farmed, and buried their dead beneath cold skies. And for nearly 500 years they held on. But even Greenland wasn't the end. Around the year 1000, Erik's son, Leif Eriksson, set out on a new voyage. Guided by stories from earlier sailors, he crossed the Davis Strait and reached a place no European had ever seen. A coastline of forests, rivers, and wild grapevines. They called it Vinland, the land of wine. Today, we know it as part of modern-day Canada. There, at a windswept place now called Meadows in Newfoundland, the Norse built sod-walled halls. They forged iron from bog ore. They repaired ships battered by the Atlantic. They explored southward, searching for timber, game, and a new beginning. It was not a conquest. It was an act of extraordinary courage. They didn't know what lay beyond the horizon. But they went anyway, and that, more than anything, defined their greatness. At the northern tip of Newfoundland, where the land narrows and the Atlantic crashes against jagged cliffs, the Norse built something unlike anything else in the New World. It wasn't a city, it wasn't a fortress, it was a camp. Temporary but bold. A statement. We were here. Known today as Meadows, this site is the only confirmed Viking settlement in North America. Built around the year 1000 AD, it was likely established by Leif Eriksson and his crew, part of an exploratory mission from Greenland to Vinland. What they created here was more than a cluster of turf walls. It was a lifeline across the sea. The Norse built 8 structures, carefully arranged in the style of Iceland and Greenland. Thick sod walls, insulated against the brutal Atlantic wind. Timber beams supported steep roofs, shaped to shed rain and snow. Inside, the glow of hearth fires lit woven tapestries and wooden beams blackened with smoke. This was not a place of haste, it was crafted with skill. In one hut, archaeologists discovered the remains of a blacksmith's workshop, charcoal, slag, and a stone anvil. From bog iron pulled from nearby wetlands, the Norse forged nails and rivets, the lifeblood of their ships. More than 90 iron fragments were found, some clipped, others bent, evidence of repairs and possibly even the construction of new vessels. Nearby, impressions in the soil mark the frame of a bodskott, a traditional Norse boat shed. They came prepared, they came to explore, but they also came to endure. And this was no mere camp of men. Buried in the soil were signs of domestic life. A bronze cloak pin, a soapstone spindle whirl, a bone needle worn smooth from use. Women had been here, sewing garments, spinning thread, mending sails. While the men forged and hunted, the women preserved what was essential: warmth, order, care. Together, they turned this outpost into a living space. Food came from the sea. Burned bones reveal a diet of fish, seals, and whales. No cattle, no pigs. These settlers brought no livestock. They lived off the land and ocean with quiet precision. Every resource was used, every decision measured. This was not a farming colony. It was a base, seasonal, strategic, and deeply calculated. Then came the discovery that reshaped everything: a butternut shell and a carved butternut burl, cut clean with a Norse blade. Butternuts don't grow in Newfoundland. They grow hundreds of kilometers to the south, in the temperate woodlands of what is now New Brunswick. Their presence proved that these Norse explorers had journeyed far beyond this camp, sailing deeper into the continent in search of resources, just as the sagas had said. This was Straumfjord, a gateway, a launch point for further ventures into Vinland. And yet, for all its promise, this place was not permanent. There are no signs of destruction, no fire, no battle, just abandonment, careful and deliberate. When they left, they took everything of value with them: What remains are the outlines of walls, a few iron fragments, and the unmistakable silence of people who once dared the unknown, and then, quietly, withdrew. But in that silence, greatness echoes. Because even here, on the far edge of the world, the Norse built with care, forged with purpose, and lived with the same resolve that had carried them across oceans. They didn't come to conquer, they came to explore, and they did. For centuries, our understanding of the Viking expansion into the North Atlantic came from stories. The Icelandic sagas, epic, poetic, and passed down by memory, told of fierce warriors, noble exiles, and impossible voyages. Written in the 13th century, they chronicled events that occurred over 200 years earlier. Their authors were Icelanders themselves, descendants of settlers writing in a Christian world, looking back through the haze of time and myth. Sagas, like the Book of Settlements and the saga of Eric the Red, described a world of drama and destiny. A world where Norsemen fled tyranny, braved hostile seas, and carved new lives into frozen land. They told of kings and chieftains, omens and gods, glory and hardship. But sagas are not blueprints. They are not precise histories. They are instead mirrors, reflecting not just the past, but the hopes and identity of the people who told them. Now, science speaks alongside story, and what it tells us is equally incredible. Through the analysis of ancient DNA, teeth, and bones, researchers have begun tracing the exact movements of Viking-age people across the North Atlantic. Enamel in teeth locks, in the chemical signatures of a person's childhood homeland. Collagen in bones tells us what they ate, where they lived, and how they survived. The results are stunning. The Norse migration was not a single clean line stretching from Norway to Iceland to Greenland. It was a network, a braided river of cultures, bloodlines, and languages. Many Norsemen brought with them women from the British Isles, wives, concubines, and slaves from Ireland, Scotland, and the Hebrides. Together they forged something new. In Shetland and Orkney, genetic studies show near equal male and female Scandinavian ancestry, evidence of full family migration. But as the voyages pushed west, that balance shifted. In Iceland, up to half the maternal DNA comes from Gaelic regions. In Greenland, Norsemen remained dominant, while the female line carried the legacy of the British Isles. The sagas rarely mention these women, but science cannot ignore them. They were there, by the hearth, on the farm, in the DNA of every generation to follow. These were not homogeneous Norse colonies. They were hybrid societies made from necessity and shaped by environment. Archaeological digs reveal evolving house structures, tool styles, and burial practices. In some sites, Slavic and Baltic influences appear. Others show traces of Christian Irish architectural forms. This wasn't cultural contamination. It was adaptation. It was survival. They fished differently, hunted differently, built differently. They shaped their new world, and it shaped them in return. And this reshaping was not weakness, it was strength. Viking greatness is too often reduced to violence and conquest. But their truest legacy may be this: resilience, ingenuity, and identity forged not in fire, but in adaptation. They crossed oceans not to impose, but to begin again. They weren't just warriors, they were builders, they were survivors, they were people. And they built communities on the edge of the world that endured long after the last saga had been sung. Greenland was never a gentle place. It was a land of stark contrasts, glittering ice fields and fertile green valleys, towering cliffs and narrow fjords. It was distant, remote, beautiful, and merciless. But in 985 AD, Eric the Red led a fleet across the sea from Iceland and claimed it for the Norse. They named it Greenland, part hope, part marketing, and people followed him. They settled in two main regions, the eastern settlement, nestled in the southern fjords, and the western settlement, nigh present-day Nook. These settlers, farmers, blacksmiths, shepherds, built lives that mirrored those they had left behind. Stone churches rose from the tundra, livestock grazed in the brief summer sun. They farmed, fished, married, and buried their dead in frozen ground. But Greenland was never easy. It was a society always on the edge of balance. Nearly everything they needed, iron, wood, grain, had to be imported from across the ocean. Their survival depended on trade routes thousands of kilometers long. And yet, the Norse adapted. They hunted walrus for ivory, tanned hides for rope, and fished the icy waters for cod. These exports were their currency. With them, they bought what they could not make. At its peak, Norse Greenland may have supported between 2,000 and 3,000 people, scattered across more than 500 farm sites. It was not a colony of luxury. It was a society of resolve. Then, the ice began to grow. By the 14th century, the climate was shifting. The Little Ice Age began its slow advance. Winters grew longer, shipping seasons shortened, pastures withered beneath early snows. Trade with Europe faltered, famine crept in. In 1492, a letter from Pope Alexander VI described Greenland as so isolated that no ship is believed to have landed there for 80 years. The world had forgotten them, and yet they endured. In 1408, a wedding was held at Volsey Church, the last recorded event from Norse Greenland. Soon after, the western settlement vanished. Some say it was disease. Others blame starvation. Some suggest conflict with the Inuit. Whatever the cause, graves grew silent and fires went cold. The eastern settlement lingered longer, but it too faded. Radiocarbon dates show life persisted into the mid-15th century, then nothing. But before they disappeared from Greenland, the Norse pushed even farther west. Around 1000 AD, Leif Eriksson and a crew sailed across the Labrador Sea and reached the rocky coast of Newfoundland. There, at Lens or Meadows, they built a seasonal base camp, sod walls, iron nails, a forge, a boat shed. They repaired ships and launched expeditions south, exploring lands richer in timber and game. The sagas tell of encounters with the Skraelings, indigenous peoples who already lived along these coasts. The stories hint at trade and conflict, misunderstandings, violence, fear. Outnumbered and far from home, the Norse withdrew. Vinland had offered promise, but not permanence. They left no cities behind, no lasting colony, just the echo of a brief, brave attempt. But they had reached the edge of the known world, and they had left their mark, one not measured in conquest, but in courage. They dared farther than any European before them, and when the world closed in, when the cold grew too sharp and the ships stopped coming, they didn't collapse. They simply vanished, leaving behind ruins, artifacts, and a story waiting to be rediscovered. They came from the fjords of Norway, born into a world of stone and salt. With longships beneath them and sky above, they crossed oceans that no European had dared. They sailed beyond maps, beyond certainty, into the margins of the world where no stories had yet been written. And there they built. They carved farms into Iceland's volcanic plains, raised livestock beneath Greenland's frozen cliffs, and lit fires in Newfoundland's wind-scoured meadows. They planted their gods in unfamiliar soil, and when the time came, they baptized their children under the sign of the cross in churches built of driftwood and stone. They didn't just survive, they adapted. They traded walrus ivory for iron, harvested the sea when field failed, and found ways to live in places no one else had even imagined settling. For centuries, they endured, quietly, proudly. And yet, they were never just Norse. They were also Gaelic, Scots, Irish, Pictish, even Slavic. Women brought from the British Isles raised Norse children at the edge of the Arctic. Languages blended, beliefs intertwined, cultures evolved. Their story was not one of empire, it was one of movement, contact, and change. They left no palaces, no roads stretching across continents. Instead, they left fragments, a spindle whorl, a forged nail, a carved butternut burl, objects buried in the earth that now tell us we were here. Science continues to speak for them. DNA maps their migrations. Isotopes in bones reveal childhood homelands and diets. Archaeology unearths the choices they made, what to bring, what to build, what to leave behind. And the image of the Viking, once locked in myth, now expands. No longer just axe-wielding raiders, they were sailors, settlers, survivors, seekers. At Lens aux Meadows, they reached North America 500 years before Columbus. They didn't stay, but they proved it could be done. They did not conquer this new world, but they stood on its shores, and they dared. And in the winds that still rush through the ruins of Greenland, across the frost-cracked halls of Iceland, and through the silent grass at Lens aux Meadows, we still hear them. Because not all explorers are remembered for what they built. Some are remembered for how far they were willing to go, and the Norse went farther than almost anyone. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the world's most fascinating historical events. Thanks for watching, and until next time.